So we're beginning today a study of the book of Ezra. It has been quite a while since I have studied the book of Ezra. I don't remember specifically when I last studied it. I have not, to the best of my recollection, ever taught a class in the book of Ezra. And so much of what I'm studying in this study is, I can't say that it's entirely new to me, but I can say that when you're called on to teach, you study with a renewed intensity. And so I'm doing that with the book of Ezra. I started to say this semester. I think it's probably not going to be a full semester. I don't know how long it will take us. We don't usually use the word semester here anyway. But let me talk for just a moment about the plan going forward. It's my understanding that we're going to study Ezra first, and then we're going to study Nehemiah following Ezra. Is that right? Ezra, that's a good combination. Ezra and Nehemiah go together. They were contemporaries. They experienced some of the same events, and those two books and the things that they address are very closely related during the time of the Jews' return from captivity. And so we'll study Ezra first, and then we'll study Nehemiah following Ezra. I am going to be here with you probably for about the next month. That's an approximation. And most of you know, maybe some of you don't, but most of you know that I actually work in Nashville. My job is in Nashville, Tennessee. And when I'm in Nashville, I am worshiping generally with the Brentwood Church there in Nashville. I know some of you have visited with the Brentwood Church and know them, and you may remember, hopefully you remember Brother Tim Beaver, who has been here and preached for us, and Tim is a member of the Brentwood Church and he's brother-in-law of Dempsey. And so I enjoy being with the brethren there and worshiping with them as I have opportunity to. So when August comes, my responsibilities, I'm a professor at a university, and during the summer, I don't teach. And so I'm here during the summer. I still have a home here in Lexington, and my intention is that Lexington is my home and Nashville is where I commute for work. And it's kind of a long commute, but that's okay. So when August comes, I'll have to be back in Nashville for work, and I will be back and forth. And it's my feeling that it is best that I not try to keep an appointment here to teach every Sunday, because there will be times when I will need to be in Nashville on Sundays. So I think Kevin, is that right? Is it Kevin is going to take over this class? And I'm not sure how far we'll get in the next month, but we'll get into the book of Ezra. And I doubt that we will finish it in a month, but we'll see what happens. Okay. And by the way, I don't often have opportunity to say this, but let me thank those of you who speak to me occasionally about driving back and forth to Lexington and wish me well in that trip. The highway is dangerous and the trip is kind of long, and I appreciate your prayers and your thoughts for the time I spend on the highway and in my work down there. And so I thank you for that. Anyway, we're going to begin. We want to do today mostly sort of an introduction to the book of Ezra, and we won't get too much into the text, but I want to talk about two things here. Primarily, I want to talk about where Ezra fits into the Bible among the other books of the Bible to help you remember where Ezra is. I don't know if you're like me, but perhaps you are and haven't studied Ezra a lot or lately, and it might be good to remind ourselves of where Ezra fits into the biblical narrative. And so we'll take a look at that, and then as we have time to, we'll take a look at where Ezra and the events depicted and described in the book of Ezra fit into the historical narrative and the timeline of the history of God's people that's presented to us in the Old Testament. So if we look at the Old Testament, particularly, we can divide the books of the Old Testament into some categories, and these are the common categories that are used. We will begin with the books of the law, and included in the books of the law are the book, starting with the book of Genesis. And Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those are often called the books of the law in the Old Testament. We're going to go through, if you look at the table of contents in your Bible, we're just going through them in the order in which they appear there, in which they are arranged in the Bible. I was raised by Christian parents, and my earliest memories, some of my earliest memories are of church and Sunday school and Bible classes, and I was taught as a small child to memorize the names of the books of the Bible. I don't know if you were, perhaps you were not, but let me suggest that if you have never done that, that it is really very helpful in your Bible study if you will memorize the names of the books of the Bible in the order in which they appear in the Bible. And then when somebody says, well, let's turn to Isaiah chapter 44, you don't have to have a page number or anything. You can turn to Isaiah and you can find Isaiah chapter 44, for example. That's a chapter we may refer to later today. And so that's the order in which we're listing them here. So they are arranged in our Bibles in this kind of category order, oddly enough. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are the books of the law. And then we have what are called sometimes the books of history. And so that's just the next book after Deuteronomy. Genesis, I have to go back and recite Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. So Joshua is next. And Judges after Joshua, and so on. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second King, First and Second Samuel. I'll abbreviate there. Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. And there's some more books of history. I'm going to stop there for just a moment. Okay. And so those are sometimes called the books of history. Now, when we divide them into these categories, we want to understand that these categories are not exclusive. That is, in the books of the law, there's a lot of history in the books of the law. So categorizing them like this maybe is just to sort of help us in remembering what's where and what's addressed in which books. If you want to read the law of Moses, go to the books of the law, you'll find the law of Moses there. But the book of Genesis is mostly there. The law is not in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is mostly just a book of history of God's people, starting at the very beginning. Right? What's the first verse? The first verse of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible is what? Do you know? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's the most important verse in the Bible? I'm guessing you're going to get a wide variety of answers if you ask people. The Bible never says this is the most important verse. And so the most important verse is going to vary depending on who you ask, and maybe what they're thinking about at that particular moment. I would suggest that for you, the most important verses in the Bible is probably that verse that particularly touched your heart and tweaked your faith and brought you to faith in God and faith in the Lord and faith in Jesus. And that would be perhaps the most important verse to you. I think of the most important verse of the Bible. For me, I think of it's that first one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, everything else that follows is an outgrowth in the Bible, is an outgrowth of that. God existed before the earth. God exists apart from the earth and apart from the universe. And the earth and the heavens and everything that are in them are God's creation, including us. And we are here, the world is here, and we are here because God chose to create us. And everything else hinges on that. And my life is not my own. My life is God, belongs to God, because my life is God's creation. And so we might want to start there. If you want to pick out a verse that's your favorite, your most important verse of the Bible, let me offer you this one as a suggestion for the most important verse in the Bible. There are many others we could choose, and we could make a good argument for other verses being the most important verse in the Bible as well. But anyway, if we start here in the beginning and you start reading forward from Genesis to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, into Joshua, Judges, Ruth, what you're doing, thinking of history, what you're doing is you're reading chronologically, roughly chronologically, through the history of God's dealing with his people. And so if you want to get a good picture of the broad sweep, particularly of Old Testament history, just start reading here and just keep on reading from one book, chapter by chapter, book by book, through Deuteronomy, to Joshua, to Judges, to Ruth, and so on down the line. And you get to the end of 2 Kings, and you have come to the basically almost, but not quite, to the end of the history of God's people in the Old Testament and God's dealings with them. And so in the books of what do we got? Genesis, we start with, Adam and Eve in the very beginning. Through Deuteronomy takes us up through the time of Moses. And then Joshua, we have the entrance into the people of Israel have left Egypt, and which they do that over in the books of the law, and they enter into the promised land and the conquest taking place in the book of Joshua, and then Judges, and so on down through the time of the Judges. We get to 1 Samuel, and now we're beginning to talk about the period of the kingdom. And when I say the kingdom, they've been a kingdom all along with God as their king, but they came to a point where that wasn't good enough, put that in quotation marks. They wanted to be like all the other nations around them, and they wanted their own human king, like all the other nations. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the kingdom. And so we begin here in 1 Samuel, and you want to read about the history of the kingdom of Israel and the kings and so on. We'll start here and read forward through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And that will give you that time period. In these books, you are aware perhaps of the division of the kingdom. We had all 12 tribes together at first, and then in the time of the son of Solomon, that was divided, and 10 tribes set up their own kingdom in the north. We call that the nation of Israel. And then the 2 tribes to the south, Judah and Benjamin, and we call that the nation of Judah after that division took place. And this narrative kind of goes back and forth between those two, and we kind of get the history of them in parallel down through the times of the kings. The northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was kind of ripped away from the dynasty of David, and they went from, it was not one uninterrupted line of father, son, father, son, father, son, but they went through different dynasties, and if you look at what the Bible says about them, I think about our own country, and I think about elections that we have, and I think about how the people leading the country have an effect on the direction of the country, politically, spiritually, even morally, and you look at the people in the time of the kings, particularly in the northern kingdom, and you look at the kings, and as the Bible describes them, who they were and what they were like. And there was not a one of them in the northern kingdom that was a man of God. And so the northern kingdom was actually destroyed in about, I think it was 721, is that the date? 700, in the 700s BC, about 721, I think is the date. The northern kingdom was invaded by the nation of Assyria. The Assyrians were the rising superpower of that time and that era. And the Assyrians were godless, pagan. They were bloodthirsty, brutal people, and they came in and they overtook that northern kingdom, and they were pretty much scattered and disseminated, and that kingdom ended, bam, right then. Okay, the southern kingdom continued by God's promise to David. They continued with that Davidic line of kings from father to son to father to son to father to son down through their history. And some of them were just as vile as some of those in the northern kingdom, but some of them actually were quite good, faithful men of God. I'm thinking of Hezekiah, for example. Now, they were all flawed human beings. I mean, even David himself, in some ways, had his serious spiritual problems. But David was a man who understood from the beginning that he was here because of God, and his life was not his own. His life belonged to God. And David was a great man of faith, although he was also a man of some weaknesses. And when David realized that he was failing in his service to God, David acknowledged it and recognized it and was penitent and mourned over his failings and his sins and tried to get himself back on track in service to God. Okay, so some of the kings following David in the southern kingdom were men of God, but some of them were just really vile. And thinking about our own history, I think about in our country here, and I think about the fact that, like, next November, no, not this fall, but next fall, 2024, we'll have our next presidential election. And, you know, the news is filled with politics. And especially from now on till that November, it's going to be increasing politics about the presidential election. I don't know how it's not my intention to talk politics here today. This is not the place for that, but it is. But I know this, sometimes we're tempted to think if we just elect the right president, the right senators, the right House of Reps, just get the right people in office in Washington, in Frankfurt, in the local county courthouse, get the right people, then everything will be fine. But you know what? First of all, that's not going to make everything fine. But at best, they're going to be in office only for a brief time, right? And they're going to at some point leave office. That's assuming the world continues. And at some point they're going to leave office and they're going to be replaced by somebody else. And then what? And I think you can see then what. If you look at the nation of Judah and you see what happened with them. Hezekiah was a good man and a good king and a godly man. And he was followed by Manasseh, who is like the worst. And so it goes. And if you look at what was really driving the arc of history of the nation of the Jews, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, yes, their kings had an effect on who they were and how they lived. But you know what was really more significant was not just the kings, but what was in the hearts of the people. And it's the hearts of the people, really, that drove the arc of history of the nation of Israel. there are more in the book of history. We've got First and Second Chronicles next. And what we get with First and Second Chronicles is sort of a reiteration, a recapitulation of that history of the kingdom period. But here in First and Second Chronicles, it seems to have been written probably during the time of Ezra, and perhaps even written by Ezra himself. I think maybe there's some uncertainty about that. I'm not an expert on those things, but if you look at the end of Second Chronicles, the last few verses of Second Chronicles, the last two verses of Second Chronicles chapter 36, verse 22 says this: "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying," and then he gives the proclamation of Cyrus here in the last two verses of Chronicles. If you look over at the first two verses of Ezra, you'll see it's exactly the same. The last two verses of Second Chronicles are the same as the first two verses of the book of Ezra. And so it is believed, this and other reasons, it is believed that Ezra may have been the author of First and Second Chronicles. By the way, Ezra comes next. Then Ezra, and then Nehemiah and Esther. And those are the books of history. That's followed by the books of sometimes called the books of poetry, also called the wisdom literature. Job comes next. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon are the books of poetry. Then we have the major prophets. And starting with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel, down through the book of Daniel. And then the minor prophets. Why are they minor? It's like they're not very important and you can ignore them. What does minor mean here? Short. It's all about how long it is, how many words there are. And the major prophets are the longer ones and the minor prophets are the shorter ones. There are 12 of the minor prophets. It's my understanding that in the Hebrew Bible, that these were grouped together like a single book and called the Book of the 12. But we have them printed in our Bibles generally as 12 separate books, the minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, down to Malachi at the end. Okay, here's some related reading to do then as you study the book of Ezra. What's your related reading? It wouldn't hurt to go back and read all of First and Second Chronicles. You get a broad sweep of history leading up to the time of Ezra. Now, that's a good bit of reading to do there, but you know, that won't hurt you. And you might find it helpful in understanding Ezra, First and Second Chronicles. Okay, but especially it would be good to read along with Ezra, to read Nehemiah and Esther, because those take place in essentially the same time period as the book of Ezra. And so it would be good to read them as well. And like I said, we'll study Nehemiah after we study the book of Ezra. Okay, the book of Esther, the king in Esther is one of the kings that shows up in the book of Ezra, the king that Esther married, the Persian king. Okay, so that's in the biblical arrangement of books where the book of Ezra is. By the way, that chronological historical narrative, we might say with First and Second Chronicles, we kind of go back and reiterate some of the same material written at that time, probably in the time of the return of the Jews back to Palestine. Probably Ezra was wanting to get them prepared for their return and remind them of where they came from and how they got there. And so perhaps that is why the books of First and Second Chronicles were written. Okay, so this is largely a chronological reading. Now we get over here and we lose the chronological nature of these books. And as we said at the beginning, these categories are not exclusive, meaning that, for example, if you go to the books of the law, you know what? There's some poetry in the books of the law. There are some actual psalms, some songs there, the song of Miriam that they sang when they, I forget exactly where that comes in the narrative, but the song of Miriam. There's some poetry in the books of the law. There's definitely some history. There is some history in the books of poetry. There are, I should have looked this up. I forget which psalm it is. There are at least a couple of the psalms that are, you read the psalm and it's very poetic in the way it's presented, but it's like a reiteration of the history of the Hebrew people. And so you find some history in the books of poetry, you find some prophecy throughout all of this. And so these categories are just sort of to help us remember. Okay, now in the historical narrative, we've already kind of hinted at that, but after, you know, we come to the end. Oh, let me give you a timeline here. When did all of this happen? All of the history that's given to us. Here's a timeline. Here's Bible history. Okay. I'm going to put an arrow going back in that direction, and I'm going to put, this is approximately 2000 BC, and we're going to put Abraham right there. These numbers are approximations, rough approximation. Don't assume they're precise, and don't take them really quantitatively literal here. Okay, but that's about 2000 BC. I'm going to go up here to this end and put a mark there, and that's about 2000 AD, and that's you there and me, and that's about where we are. Okay, so we're going to take this and go to the middle, and we'll pretend that's exactly in the middle. And what's there? There's Christ. I'll put a little cross there to represent Christ, and that's about the year 0. It's my understanding there wasn't a year 0. That's the time of Jesus. Remember, we're talking approximately here. Okay, so there is Christ. Okay, so we divided it in the middle. Now we're going to go to this part, and we're going to go to the middle of that. That's about 1000 BC. What do we find there? Who do we find there? David. David, Saul, who preceded David, Solomon, who followed him. That's approximately the time of David, 1000 BC. Okay, now we're going to go to this between Abraham and David, and we're going to go to the middle of that. What do we find? Who do we find there? There's Moses. About 1500. Now, there is some difference of opinion about this. You will find there are people who would say that Moses and the Exodus was about in the 13th century BC. I think, you know, that's not a point I want to really argue with anybody, but I think they're mistaken. I think the stronger the stronger date, stronger biblical evidence is to put Moses, he was in about the 15th century BC. And so we'll put Moses there. And if you'd like to talk further about just when Moses lived, I'd be glad to talk about that offline with you. I find that all very interesting, but I don't think it's particularly important to us here. But I think Moses was about 1500 BC. Okay, now let's go here in between David and Christ, and let's go to the middle of that. And what do we find there? There's Ezra. Okay, there's Ezra. And right here then is the time of the kingdom. The united kingdom first with Saul and David and Solomon, and then the divided kingdom on up to the end of the northern kingdom in 721, and then on up to the end to the captivity, at least, of the southern kingdom. And we're talking approximately 500 years before Christ. Is the time of Ezra. Okay, so if you just go by halves each time, you can find Ezra here approximately. Now, we could talk more precisely about dates, and there's a part of me that's tempted to do that, but I think it's maybe not particularly helpful. As we get up into this time period, up into the later kingdom period and the time of the captivity and the return, we start having events that start showing up in the history written by the Greek historians, such as Herodotus, and we start being able to correlate biblical events with secular history events, and we start getting more precise with some of the dates at that point. Okay, so we could put some more precise dates, particularly around the time of the captivity and return. And if you're interested in those, you can find them. I'm not particularly interested in them here for this study. That you remember that the Babylonian captivity, when the Chaldeans came in and came into Jerusalem and conquered Jerusalem and took the nation of Judah, and took them into captivity and Babylon. That was, as I understand, it was 606 BC. I don't think it, in my opinion, it's not particularly important that you remember that exact date. So I'm not concerned about memorizing and learning those exact dates here. But if you're interested, there is reading material that you could get to that would help point you towards some of that, and you might be interested in learning more precisely about some of the time periods and the dates. We're going to call it approximately 500 BC, about halfway between David and Christ. Okay, so there we go. What time? We're supposed to quit at 1:45. Is that right? 10 to. We just had a bell, and that seemed like kind of an early bell to me. I'm not sure what the bell ringing schedule is here going to be, but we'll go to about 10 till. Okay, so we got a few more minutes now. About 15 more minutes. By that clock's never right. About 10 more minutes. Okay. Speaking of more precise history, we could talk more precisely about the history of the captivity and the time that the Jews were in captivity and bondage in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity, and what happened there. There was some history there that happened before the time of Ezra. Okay, as I mentioned, it's actually a little bit before Ezra. 606 is the time the Babylonians came in and cleaned house. Read the prophets. I erased the categories here, but read the prophets, and there are prophecies taking place there about what was going to happen and what they should do and how they should repent and what was going to happen if they didn't and so on. And all of that is important to study too. That's not really what we're studying now. But the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, you remember Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and the Babylonians came in and took the people to Babylon. The Babylonians, by the way, were not much better than the Assyrians. We've already mentioned the Assyrians were brutal and inhumane to their captives, and all they cared about was their power and control. And the northern kingdom that was taken by the Assyrians was scattered. Some of them, by the way, you know that term, the 10 lost tribes of Israel? You've heard that said, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They weren't all lost. All right. There were some remnants of people who are identified as members of some of those 10 tribes that continue to be identifiable down through history. And even if you look even at the time of Jesus, there were some people in the time of Jesus that were known to be of some of those other tribes. But the northern kingdom as a political unit and as a kingdom was gone at the time of the Assyrian captivity. The Assyrians were really brutal to their captives. The Babylonians were not much better than the Assyrians were. The Babylonian kingdom fell and fell quickly. It doesn't always happen gradually. You know, the Roman Empire kind of crumbled and fell apart gradually over the course of centuries. The Babylonian Empire fell very quickly, and the Persians took over at the time of Cyrus, and their first king was Cyrus. I mentioned a while ago Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah was like 200 years before this. And it's interesting, if you go to Isaiah chapter 44 in the prophecies, it's like, there's no way to deny this. The book of Isaiah is known to be ancient in our day. Nobody disputes that. Nobody really disputes that it was a book of prophecy. Now, people may dispute whether it really came from God or not, but it's really undeniable the age and the ancientness of the book of Isaiah. Okay, here's what Isaiah says in chapter 44 in talking about what they've got ahead of them. In verse 27, it says, "It is I who says to the depth," I'm reading from the New American Standard Version, "It is I who says to the depth of the sea, be dried up, and I will make your rivers run dry. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all of my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid." It is Cyrus who will do this and who will build the temple back. This was 200 years before anybody ever heard of Cyrus. And the book of Isaiah tells us who he is, tells us what his name is and what he's going to do. I look at things like that in the old prophecies, and it helps to bolster and solidify my faith in the scripture of God. How could anybody 200 years before know it was going to be a king named Cyrus who was going to do this? I don't know, when Cyrus was born and when Cyrus became the head of the Persian kingdom and became the king and developed this great empire, did Cyrus know of this prophecy? I don't know if Cyrus knew of this prophecy, but he was fulfilling the prophecy of God, even down to even what his name was. Okay, so anyway, that's Cyrus, and Cyrus is king of the Persians. The Persian kings are interesting in a way, even in the modern day. the Persian kings. What country in the world is the sort of the historical descendant of Persia? There is, where would Persia be on your map today? What would the country be? Do you know? Iran, exactly. Iran. I had a student, this was several years ago now, I had a student who was, he was an engineering student, and he was, I don't remember what his name was, but it was a name whose ethnic origin I could not identify. He spoke English he spoke English very well, probably better than I do, but he spoke with a distinct accent. And I'm a curious guy. And so I just asked him in a private conversation, I asked him one time, well, what is your ethnic background? Like, where are you from? And this was long enough ago that it was a time that there was a lot of political tension at that time between the United States and Iran. And I asked him where he's from, and he got this pained look on his face, like, I'm afraid this guy is about to, meaning me, is about to discriminate against me or something. I thought he was curious. So I asked him where he's from. He said, I'm Persian. So, oh, you're from Iran. Well, yeah, I'm from Iran. But that's the way he identified himself, as Persian. The people of Iran are generally Muslims, and in that way, they have a close relationship to the Arabs. But I will tell you, the Iranians, the Persians, will tell you they are not Arabs. They are very distinct from Arabs, and they've got 3,000 years of cultural history that's distinct from the Arab culture. Okay, Cyrus, the king, was followed by another king, was followed by another king, was followed by another king. And it is one of the longest unbroken lines of succession, not all one family, but one unbroken line of succession from Cyrus in the time of Ezra down to, you know who I'm thinking of? Shah Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. Some of you older people, older like my age, and older, will remember when the Shah was still the head of Iran, and then they had the Islamic Revolution, and he was deposed and he went into exile, and that ended the kingdom. That was a 3,000-year-long kingdom, and he was the sort of the historical successor to Cyrus here in an unbroken line of kings. I think that's interesting. I don't know about you, but to me that's interesting. So I'm sure there are people in Iran now, probably perhaps political dissidents against the current regime, who would hope to restore that kingdom. And the Shah's son is still living, I believe, and they would hope to restore that kingdom. I don't know if that'll ever happen. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, who knows. But anyway, that's who Cyrus was. He was the original Shah of Iran, sort of. He was Persian, okay? Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying. And then we have the proclamation. Now, let's pause for a moment and think about what's happening here. This proclamation from Cyrus, was this just Cyrus's idea of what he is about to proclaim here? Where did this idea of this proclamation come from? Came from God, didn't it? God stirred up the heart of Cyrus to do this, and the prophets had already talked about this. We just saw that in the book of Isaiah. The prophets he mentions Jeremiah here. The prophets had already talked about this. And Cyrus probably, I'm guessing, I don't know what it would be like to have your heart stirred up by God in the way Cyrus's heart was stirred up by God. Yeah, what would that be like? I don't know. My guess is Cyrus probably didn't realize that what he was doing was the fulfillment of prophecy, and what he was doing was actually coming from God and the choice he was making here. But I will say this, we look at Cyrus and we look at the Persians, they were not as brutal and inhumane generally as the Babylonians were and the Assyrians were. And so we see Cyrus here is acting not entirely out of character with the way he conducted his reign and his kingdom, but we see that that is coming not just from some idea that Cyrus concocted entirely on his own. This is coming from God. Okay, so what's the proclamation? Thus says Cyrus. Here's what he says. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem, and every survivor at whatever place he may live. Let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a free will offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. We're about out of time. That was the bell. So I guess we're about out of time. So this is the proclamation of Cyrus. Notice he is much more humane and magnanimous to the people that are under his control. And he is inviting the people of Israel to return. Would you like to do that? You can return, and you can go back to your home, to your place in Jerusalem, and you can rebuild your temple, and you can worship your God. Let me leave this thought with you. Think about this. Cyrus refers here to the Lord, the God of heaven. And let me ask you about Cyrus. Had Cyrus become a worshiper of Jehovah? Has he given up pagan worship? And when he's speaking here and he refers to the Lord, the God of heaven, does that mean Cyrus has become a servant of the true and living God? So you think about that and read forward in the book of the first and second chapter of the book of Ezra. Do some of the related reading too. That would be a good thing if you have time to between now and next Sunday. And I will see you then, Lord willing.